Our next session is Safeguarding Information, Accessing Facts in an AI-Driven World. Please welcome our speakers to the stage.
Hello, my name is Courtney Radge. I'm the director of the Center for Journalism and Liberty. Delighted to be here today for this important session on safeguarding information. We have our wonderful panelists here, although I will notice that Rasmus is now a professor at the University of Copenhagen, so we might update that at some point. As we talk about accessing facts and the rise of generative AI, it's really important for us to think about the information ecosystem, that we're talking about more than just the individual. We're talking about an entire ecosystem that includes, of course, individual beliefs, their thoughts about trust and society, but it's also about the media system, which of course includes news, but also entertainment and other forms of non-factual news, as well as things like science information. It also matters about the legal framework, the public and private sector. How do we govern the platforms, whether we're talking about media or AI and technology platforms within this information ecosystem? And what are the business models that AI especially is driven now? Because this is the fundamental difference in today's information ecosystem, is the rise of generative AI. So over the past almost 2 years since ChatGPT came on the scene, we've seen that at the beginning you could ask ChatGPT something or these other services, and they wouldn't give you new responses. You couldn't get factual, updated temporal responses to questions about news or elections. But over the past 2 years, we've seen companies across the board roll out chatbots, news summarization, generative search, content generation, images, audio, et cetera, that are fundamentally changing how we get facts, how we access information, and how we generate content. So whereas we used to have, let's get information over here and generate content over here, they're now combined into one system, which has some really interesting implications for facts. And one of the really important things for us to consider about generative AI is the important role of data, both in terms of a quantity, that's one of the reasons we've had these advances in AI, but also quality. And retrieval augmented generation, which is what makes these chatbots and these generative AI services able to access timely, new, relevant information, depends on access to quality information. And that is where we get to the discussion today, because when we talk about accessing facts, it's important to think about how can we leverage these systems, how do facts flow in these systems, but also realizing a lot of our communication isn't actually about facts. It's about perception. But let's start first with facts, because as you heard earlier today, we're in the year of elections globally. And chatbots have a pretty mixed history, or it's not current history, with how they return factual information about elections. And we've had recent reports out from the United States, Proof News and NewsGuard, showing that election-related information on chatbots is very poor. But then Rasmus, the Reuters Institute recently did a study that showed that chatbots were relatively good on UK election information, but also pretty bad on returning news. So it feels to me like, what is actually happening with AI chatbots? How is generative AI responding when asked for facts, especially election information?
I mean, at this stage, our research suggests that people aren't primarily using the chatbots as a way to acquire factual information, which is probably quite healthy. I mean, they're more used for ideation, for feedback, as conversational partners, to generate various kinds of content that might then be edited into a final form and used, or to produce code and the like. But we do see a significant subset of the population saying that they use these chatbots to try to access news and information. So we try to get a handle on what you actually get if you ask them. The first thing we did was to ask a sample of different chatbots to give us, as a user, the top 5 stories now from a named news site. And essentially, they were pretty poor at that in the sense that in most cases, the response is, I'm unable to. Sometimes probably because the companies behind the chatbots are a bit careful with this, but also, of course, because in some instances, the publishers have blocked the crawlers from accessing the site, so they may not actually be able to fetch the stories. And even in the cases where you do get something, we didn't identify in the data set any clear examples of full-on hallucination where specific facts were stated that were imaginary and untrue. But we did get a lot of like highly variable quality output that weren't the last stories, were in a few cases stories from competitors, from other brands that misattributed to a brand, and in some cases just output that was so generic that it's hard to tell what one is to make of it. Political scandal unfolds. What is one to make of that? What is the actual specific output there? So that was the work we did in April. But then we tried to sort of think about, okay, well, if one tries to use these bots not to access news as news organizations publish it, but because you as a citizen might have specific factual questions you would like an answer to in the run-up to an election. These could be very basic things. What are the candidates in this constituency? They can be more complicated things like how does a first-past-the-poll system actually work? Or they can be things that are higher stakes and often a bit more controversial, but to which we have a reasonable example of a ground truth that we can code the output against, namely situations in which someone has made a factual statement and fact checkers have checked it and found it to be untrue. So we tested a battery of 100 such questions, work led by Felix Simon. And there, as you said, I mean, I don't want to say that the results were good, because I think what we found is that about 80% of the outputs were correct. That also implies, of course, that 20% were partially correct or incorrect, which is, you know, quite a lot. And if it's the wrong incident in which people get false information about, you know, say when you can vote, that can be very important and quite consequential. But at the same time, the difference between the very poor experience of asking for news in a fairly generic sense versus the generally much more immediately satisfying and useful experience of using election-related queries, at least here in the UK, where good public domain information is available from the Electoral Commission, from the Houses of Parliament, from the Hansard, from Full Fact and other sources that the chatbots can rely upon if they have access to the internet, as the ones we used do, gives you a very different experience, and one I think is likely to be much more satisfying from the point of view of a lot of citizens.
So, I mean, I think that's a really important point, that maybe in contexts where you have access to factual quality information, you mentioned the Electoral Commission, et cetera, these are the same bodies that say journalists are also getting their facts from, so there's a common denominator, and that information is available for free to the public. Now, Graham, you run an institute that focuses on looking at influence operations, and sometimes that's around facts, but a lot of time it's really more about propaganda. It's about a certain worldview or perspective, and I think that many of us know here that generative AI is essentially a giant autocomplete, right? It is a predictive, data-driven machine learning engine that takes, you know, what we know based on the inputs that it gathers. And one of the things that I think we're seeing is some chatbots, especially, you know, things like Grok, for example, have an ideological bent. And the responses they return are going to be based on the type of information that they're trained on. So a NewsGuard study found that chatbots were returning Russian misinformation or propaganda 30% of the time on certain topics, probably because a lot of their training data reflected the, you know, years of Russian influence operations that have been happening. How are you thinking about and seeing the influence of influence operations by foreign actors and by domestic actors showing up in the information system now that we're in this AI-driven era?
The short answer is it's still early days. And this year has been one of the best and most concentrated sources of data. This is overly academic, sources of data and case studies that you could possibly have on this, but it's still early days. There isn't a hard and fast answer. What we're seeing in the foreign influence space in particular, which is one set of online harms that includes usage of GAI, is that we're seeing a lot of content creation by foreign actors using GAI, generative artificial intelligence, but that doesn't necessarily mean that their information operations are more effective or causing more behavior change. Full stop. And so for us, at the very beginning of this year, we knew that we were going to have a lot of work to do. So we got a lot of the kind of primary researchers across this space together. We said, what is the worst possible thing that could happen in this global year of elections in the information environment in which we don't know what the impact of GAI is going to be on the information environment yet? And that was a really uplifting conversation. And we looked at all of we brainstormed all the things. We did red teaming to say, okay, if this happens, then why could happen, et cetera. And then for the rest of the year, this was back in January, for the rest of the year, we looked at case studies to correlate to what we thought was in the realm of the possible. And what we've seen on not just foreign influence, but a broader set of online harms is, number one, it's still early days. And I should say in the meantime, there were any number of headlines that we've all read throughout the year that said, AI and GAI is going to supercharge disinformation about everything. And our findings so far have been, number one, still early days. We still need a lot more data. We still need a lot more case studies to have a higher confidence in our assessment on the impact of GAI, in particular on behavior change. Not necessarily on content creation. The answer is yes, but on behavior change. Does the fact that artificial intelligence or generative artificial intelligence being used in influence operations, either by state actors or domestic actors, lead to more sophisticated information operations or behavior change, more engagement over time? And we don't know yet. And so that ends up being a big question on researcher access over time. The second thing is that we see pervasive uses of GAI by state actors and domestic actors, or actors across the information environment that are just engaging in the information environment. But again, not persuasive. Pervasive, but not persuasive. And then the third thing is that we're going to need, if we're talking about safeguarding right now, we're going to need researcher access and different monitoring regimes for different uses of GAI, which is something that we're working on right now. GAI usage for text-based content, the monitoring regime for that is going to be a lot different than GAI usage for synthetic audio, for instance.
But just, don't you feel to some extent that this focus on the mechanics maybe detracts from the broader issues that Maria and Kara raised earlier today about, the VDOM studies show these vast declines in trust.
Right.
We have declines in democracy. So whether or not we can correlate this specific piece of GAA content or influence operations with a behavior change, right, the fact is we see deep declines in trust across institutions of all types and in, the very idea of facts.
Well, and this is the last and most important finding of this entire year, is that just the fact of GAI itself accelerates an erosion of trust. If anything could have been created by generative artificial intelligence, then it means that anything that you're engaging with, just as a basic user, it is a little more scary. Takes a little more work to verify. Takes a little bit longer to figure out whether it's from a trustworthy source or not. And so where we've seen an overall decline in trust over time, GAI, just the advent of it, not the impact, the tactics, the mechanics, and all of these interesting policy questions or design questions that we need to answer in pretty short order, and there's being a lot of really good work being done on it. The basic thing is that the advent of GAI just in general, the fact that we're on, ChatGPT 6 point whatever, by the end of this conversation it'll be 8, et cetera, just that trend line erodes trust. And I don't think that we have a good answer for that yet.
Right, and so one of the issues with that is we saw OpenAI, launch ChatGPT to the world with arguably not even close to enough safeguards, and then a lot of other companies obviously rushed to get their products out, including Google, for example, whose own researchers said this is not ready for prime time, it shouldn't be released, but generative AI, you feel you've got to compete, and now the gate's open. Now, Ginny, Microsoft, you run the Democracy Forward program, this corporate social responsibility initiative. I think, Copilot sees factual information as important. How are you thinking about securing access to factual or quality information, especially when we're seeing a real upward trend in quality sources of information, whether we're talking about news organizations, science, other information providers putting their content behind paywalls or subscriptions, or telling AI crawlers you can't crawl this because of the licensing and compensation issues. There was a study by the Data Provenance Initiative that found of 14,000 of the most important quality sources for AI models that there's a significant upward trend. More than 50% globally, news organizations are are prohibiting crawlers, 75% in the US. And that's kind of a reaction against this, again, taking of the quality information. How are you trying to navigate making sure that you're able to have, factual information and support the information producers that produce that sort of factual information so you can have a useful and safe product?
Sure. Well, I'll start by all the tech companies that have anything to do with the generation side of AI has a responsibility. And I think what's been a little bit different this time around is that you're actually seeing a lot of the technology companies acknowledging that responsibility. And so while that may seem like table stakes, and frankly it is a movement in the right direction. So it starts with taking responsibility that we are creating these products, we're putting these products out into the world. And while we are very focused, of course, on how it'll extend opportunity, because there is, as we've heard today, a lot of opportunity there, we also need to look at the harms that could come from it too. How both innocuous use of it could lead to harm, and then, of course, how nefarious actors who are looking to weaponize it, as they weaponize every new technology, will do that as well. And so that's the kind of foundation that we all need to start from. When it comes to actual sources of data and information, one thing that's interesting that I have found as I've sort of gone through this as well, my background is not as a data scientist, it is not in generative AI, so I have also been learning as the company's been evolving in this process, is a lot of times when we are trying to identify where the biggest harms could come from, we'll use elections as the example, in part because it's a lot of the work that I do, but also it's topical. When we look at elections and we talk about the harms that could come, we look at things like access to voter information about the critical aspects of voting, how, when, where to vote. We see crossing that line as a serious harm and something that we do not want to contribute to. And so while the instinct is, okay, well, we need to train the model then on the most accurate voting information. A couple of reasons that that's a flawed assumption. First of all, voting information actually changes. The day and the location of polling information, that is constantly moving. You cannot depend on a model to have been trained on the most accurate information about voting because it's not static, right? That is a changing thing. That's one reason. The other is that's not actually how these models best return information when you're in an environment where they have sources, right? I know we're sort of making a distinction between chatbots that are just pure Gen AI chatbots and those that are grounded in search and the internet. So when we look at Copilot, which is obviously our product, the one that we have the most responsibility for, we actually went out and identified partners who would have the most accurate information. So we talk about the UK, obviously that's at the federal level. In some places in Europe, that's pretty easy to go to as far as who is the source of accurate information. And a lot of that information actually doesn't change much. In the US, as we all know, it is very different. The counties in some cases are in charge of it. The states in some cases, it's really dependent. So we did a partnership with the National Association of, I always have to say it right, State Election Directors, or NASED, where they're providing us with constant, accurate, updated information. And it's not actually being trained at the model level, it's being surfaced after the model has been queried. And so making sure that when someone goes into our site and looks for information about how to vote, that they get information that is first referencing that information is important. That's just an example. You're getting at the broader question of journalistic integrity and how do we know when people are searching for sort of breaking news that they're getting the most accurate information. But actually the model applies there as well. It's not in what has been trained on. That is essential and important to making sure that the information that comes across is said in a way that is clear and accurate and doesn't hallucinate, and there's a lot of intervention points that the tech companies need and are taking at that. But it's really looking at what is the most recent news and information, which frankly we have paired up with our Bing search index. And so every company is going to respond to that question different, because it will ultimately depend on their product. What is the product that they're working on, where they see these harms, where are their intervention points, what can and should they do to ensure that accurate information based on the query that is being asked is being returned. And it's going to depend, not to sound like a lawyer and get to the end. It depends, but that's ultimately where we land on it. So we look product by product at how we reduce harm, extend opportunity, and then there are times, as I'm sure you found when you were doing your research, there are times when we deem the harm too great and actually just don't answer that question. And we'd like to get to a place where we're answering these questions accurately and with the most recent information. But if we deem the harm is too great to get there, we will actually defer the question until we think that the product is safe enough to do that.
So Rasmus, let me go to you, because you have been studying chatbots and been kind of a leader in the field of understanding how the impact of changes in technology influences the news industry. And there is a political economy of factual information. It actually takes a lot of money to go out and report the news, do the science that figures out the latest information about climate change or whatever that is. What have you seen in the industry in terms of how the ability to continue funding the production of quality information is going to be affected by the developments of generative AI, especially as we see the fewer and fewer searches, no more clicking through on links to generate the paltry amounts of advertising funding that were being generated, or other business models really being challenged by that. What are you seeing?
Well, things can always get worse. And I think we have to be very clear that right now, I think the only reasonable assumption is that if generative AI becomes more and more central to how people access and use information, that's going to intensify a lot of the pressures that exist in the inherited business of news. And I think it'll reinforce the winner-takes-most dynamics that we see, where a limited number of generally sort of national or international upmarket general interest bundles are able to retain a direct connection to a privileged and affluent news-interested audience who are willing to pay attention and pay. And once they get that flywheel spinning, that can go quite well for them, actually, in some cases better than what the past was like for them. And then there'll be a number of sort of niche and vertical sites that serve highly specialized information needs and are often based on sort of B2B subscription packages. But a lot of other titles and those upmarket national general interest titles who don't want to adapt or can't adapt to a digital media environment are already in serious trouble, and this is going to intensify that. So I think the outlook for the industry is pretty gloomy, I would say. Of course, generative AI can also be used by news organizations. Realistically, I think we have to expect that a lot of the news industry are going to use Gen AI as sort of faster horses. They're going to produce more of something that neither audiences nor advertisers seem to want more cheaply. That's going to solve exactly 0 of their business problems, because the central business problem is value creation, and more of something that's worthless is not more valuable. I'm sorry to be a bit blunt about this, but I think we need to sort of call it as we see it. And then on the positive side, I think Claire made a very important point on the panel before lunch about using generative AI in sort of truth-enhancing ways. It can also serve people better with better information, more personalized information, more tailored information, different formats, different genres. So I'm optimistic that we'll see some really exciting stuff as well. If we turn away from the news side, because I think you were very clear about the importance of the sort of wider ecology of information sources, one of the things I would encourage everyone to pay the most attention to in the years ahead is how public authorities react to their role as information providers in this environment. If you think back to the pandemic and think about all the COVID dashboards that lots of news organizations had, the choices that were made there editorially about what good enough data looks like in a world in which we now know for a fact that COVID mortality statistics were distorted or falsified in Brazil, in India, in Nicaragua, and other countries, I think we're going to see some quite boring and nerdy but very consequential changes in what kind of information is made available to whom by governments in the years ahead. And in a sense, in countries where one can have confidence in the integrity and availability of public statistics, I think we're going to have quite a lot of pretty good information available also through chat and AI interfaces of various sorts. But in countries in which governments or others are able and willing to distort, falsify, and corrupt all these statistics, the models will produce garbage. Garbage in, garbage out.
Speaking of garbage in, Graham, not
You know, that's pretty common in our world.
just because you focus on, propaganda and influence operations, which I would consider, a lot of that is garbage.
Right.
And it is incredibly cheap to produce garbage. So we know already that 56% of the internet text is likely generated by AI, and researchers are looking at upwards of 90% of information online is going to be AI generated or synthetic media within the next few years. We're seeing, what Cory Doctorow refers to as the enshittification of the internet. Not a small amount of which has been propelled by the preponderance of influence operations, and that have really taken advantage of the dominant tech platforms, the social media, information sharing, communications platforms, and now it seems also of AI platforms. What recommendations do you have to these companies? We talked early, we heard earlier on the first panel about businesses being so trusted, despite the fact that a lot of these platforms are being used for influence operations. What recommendations do you have to them in terms of how to better design or govern their products so that they're not leveraged to perpetuate and entrench influence operations and generative AI crud?
Any session with safeguarding in the title is just going to be so uplifting. So welcome back from lunch, and it's could be going better. I think that where we're looking at solutions, you have to look at an entire ecosystem of stakeholders. And so to Rasmus's point, for media, you have to understand AI tooling is a major opportunity. It is.
Okay, but I want to press you. I want you to talk about for the platforms what they can do, because we do have a session on news.
Right. But here's what you have to understand what the actual mechanics are. If you're looking at AI as a way to curate data, then it's a really, really good tool. For reporting, for government tracking, for any of these things. If you're looking at it as a probability mechanism to understand what the probability of language is on any given thing, and you're looking at the open internet, you're probably not going to yield very good results. And so for media, that's one thing. For industry, you have to have safeguards. We have to figure out what the term red teaming means. The policymakers in the European Union, policymakers in the United States are very focused on red teaming writ large. There's not a huge amount of granularity on what we mean by red teaming tooling. And so we have to create an ecosystem for that in particular. That is something that the platforms have a direct stake in. Basic testing, provenance testing, there's any number of things that from a design standpoint, platforms can and should be doing more of. And for government, there's any number of things that they have to get done right now in a coherent way in order for platforms to even be required or incentivized to do those things. Or frankly, have security in doing those things. And so for government, if there is a major schism, for instance, between the United States and the EU right now, or if we haven't taken care of some of the basic expression of rights in the digital age, I'll pick on the United States right now because that is where I am visiting from. We don't have a federal data privacy standard. We don't have a basic set of privacy standards for our citizens in a digital age. And that is like the most basic table stakes or eating your vegetables approach to having any governance standards in this space, not only for AI, but for everything else.
Yeah.
When your citizens are engaged. And so if all of those stakeholders aren't doing something, or the nearest thing that they could be doing, like data privacy standards, like risk testing, like figuring out how the actual mechanics of what models can and should be doing in media industry, all of those things have to happen all at once. And that's really unfortunate because we don't have a huge amount of time.
Right. Quick point on that?
I mean, I just wanted to amplify something I think Ritu and Claire said on the last panel, which is I think we should keep front and center that the most consequential misinformation in our societies is authentic. It's from known domestic elite political sources, and it is not exclusively online, because it's often professed at press conferences or in televised debates or at events and other things that are mediated in a number of different ways. And if we keep that front and center, then AI is a bit orthogonal to this stuff, because it becomes more about the wider ecosystem, as you put it yourself in your framing of this. And the challenge for platform companies, and I'd be curious to hear Ginny's point of view on this, is that in a world in which a sort of middle-aged man in California a few years ago said he didn't want to be the arbiter of truth, where governments generally like to say that they want someone to do something about something, but whenever something is actually done, you hear the cries of censorship and interference and whatnot. Remember when Donald Trump was belatedly content moderated for repeatedly violating the terms of service of multiple US American technology companies? What was the reaction from major politicians around the world? It was, how dare you?
Right.
How dare you? It was not, that was about time, right? So the companies, I think, in one sense are cowards. But it's also, look, they are businesses, and they are operating in a legal environment, and they are responding to a politically diverse user base and operating in a world in which it's very clear that there's political appetite in the general for someone doing something as long as it doesn't concern us, right?
And it's interesting because to your point about the legal environment and Graham's point about privacy is you've seen that a lot of the AI companies are not using social media content from, say, LinkedIn, for example, not using European data because it could violate GDPR, Twitter, et cetera. So Europeans have greater protections for privacy, going back to the legal point. I want to invite folks to use the QR code to put up in their questions so I can take those. And while we're getting those in, just Jenny, going to you, to this design issue, Microsoft, if I remember correctly, is one of the founding members of the Content Provenance and Authentication Initiative. This is around, let's make sure that we know where our information is coming from, embed this sort of labeling, et cetera. How do you think that is going to have an impact, not on the individual consumer, because personally I get very frustrated at, let's try to make everyone responsible for, figuring out what's true or not in this very challenging environment. But how are you using it at a platform level to improve information flows or outputs from your generative AI products?
It builds on, Claire should just join us because at this point we are invoking her so much. But it builds on what Claire was talking about, and she and I work together a lot on this question. So there's a lot that can be done from the generative AI creation companies to make sure that there are indicators in the things that they are creating that says where it came from, who created it, et cetera. And right now we're using C2PA's standard to do that on Bing Image Creator, for example. DALL-E is doing the same thing. Most of the sort of reputable content creation companies are applying some kind of standard or watermark. Where the challenge is twofold. One, it's an adoption. And so it was pointed out that not all creators of this content are using something like C2PA or watermarking or something to indicate that it was AI generated. So the adoption on the actual creation side is a problem. And then there's the adoption on the distribution side. And adoption's maybe the strong word to use here. Maybe it's more agreement of how we should actually be labeling and displaying this information to users. So for example, she was referring to the fact that some companies think that just slapping a created by AI label is sufficient, but of course that's not totally clear what that means. And if it's only if they're reading it from an AI generated image, does that mean something that didn't use that and therefore doesn't have the label wasn't AI generated, right? There's so much confusion when it comes to this space. And so in the short term, there's not a lot of great news other than the companies are talking about this and trying to work towards some kind of best practices, which is going to look like almost more of a cybersecurity defense in-depth approach than anything else. We should have Yes, we should have C2PA data applied to these things. Yes, we should label in some way. We need to agree on some kind of consistent labeling so the consumer doesn't have to do the work. It's something they're used to seeing. We're all used to seeing the lock URL when we enter a credit card, right? That's based on standards and communication across lots of different technology companies. So let's get to a place where we have the equivalent of the lock URL. That's not just saying if it's AI generated, but tells you more about the image. This image came from this organization. It's labeled by the BBC, meaning the BBC is who generated it in the first place. And if it was changed along the way, or if there was AI generation involved, that's just another data point that they should consume.
I'm a big fan of, let's impose data provenance. We talk here about, misinformation for safety issues, but it would actually be a two-pronged solution because it would also could help us solve the copyright, intellectual property, and licensing issues. If we can trace data provenance for safety of information, we can also trace it for copyright, which personally, I think if we don't fund the information producers by paying for their intellectual property, then we're going to have a real hard time preventing the spread of misinformation.
Just one more point on that I think is incredibly important is that so far we found that this is actually fairly bipartisan. This idea of protecting likeness, this idea of preventing fraud, this resonates across lots of different political perspectives. If you get away from content and disinformation in this context and you have a conversation about no one wants to be defrauded of their image, everyone wants to protect their likeness, that tends to resonate with politicians and others because they don't want someone else depicting them either. So this is a good line. I do think we have a path forward here.
Yeah, and that's great. And that was kind of one of the questions was around the use of these tools to create images. And that's something that I know is being discussed in the US Congress and I think elsewhere. One of the questions that we have here is around, the fact that AI models don't actually know facts, right? They are simply generating text based on learned patterns. And that is based on the sources of information. So the question is around how to stop humans or others from spreading biased news, lies, and disinformation. I think that is a whole science in and of itself. But if I could ask Graham, could you discuss how could we prevent models from being poisoned by kind of the bad information or the evil unicorns, as a term you used? Yep. Earlier.
Well, there has to be transparency standards for platforms in particular, and not necessarily transparency standards for everything, especially for companies that are running closed models in particular, but transparency standards for the basic utility of their tool. Where is the data that model is being trained on coming from?
But so then would you prevent, for example, okay, you're not allowed to use certain like RT as an information source, or how does that then get to, you have transparency, but that doesn't by de facto improve the models or the outputs?
Right, but it gives us more information to make decisions, such as RT should not be a source that this model is trained on. And it gives the consumer more power to say, I'm going to use this tool because RT is not included in the data set that this model is being trained on.
Okay.
And it goes to an earlier point on curation versus generation or probability. If you're asking a model a probability question, then you're probably not going to get a very good answer back. If you're asking it a data-driven question, something that is measurable, then you're probably going to get a slightly better answer that you should also still, as a consumer, double-check and verify.
But Rasmus, I want to ask you this question too, because you've researched how people, is asking people to look into which model is using which sources of information. I mean, to me, that seems like that's not really a great solution for improving facts. Do you have other ideas about how these models can work, or these tools and applications can be designed to improve factual or less propagandistic content from being generated and spread?
I mean, I'm all for transparency, but I agree with what you intimated in your own remarks earlier on, that there is a danger of sort of, shoving all the responsibility onto the end user, as we've also seen in climate discussions, and not thinking about the systemic issues, and I think that is a concern. So I think transparency, yes, and the question then is the and. I have to say, I think we have to be modest about what we think can be achieved in terms of sort of assessing the quality of the output, because as soon as you move beyond the kinds of things that model developers are already testing against, standardized multiple choice testing, performance at board games with known rules, generation of code that can run and the like, where you have sort of meaningful benchmarks. When you get into a lot of stuff that has to do with public discourse, it becomes much harder. You said this yourself in your opening remarks. A lot of public discourse isn't narrowly about discrete, verifiable facts. And one of the sort of ironies of the recent years of political misinformation is how stupid and clumsy some of it has been, right? I mean, it's when you begin saying verifiably false things about who's eating dogs that you can say, oh, this man is actually making things up. If you just said, well, we all know who's eating the dogs, don't we? Then conversational implicature will do the rest of the job for you, and you don't actually need to lie or say something false.
Right.
And a lot of public discourse is like that. Think back to all those AI, doom and gloom articles from January and February. What was the verifiable factual content of that? It was that the sources the journalists had talked to had said some things. It wasn't actually that AI was going to, wipe everyone's brain out and make people into zombies voting one way or another in the elections this year, right? So a lot of public discourse can't, I think, really be measured in terms of the quality. And I think that really brings us back to a classical, what used to be a sort of common denominator of small c conservatives and called small c liberalism in many Western societies and small s social democracy for that matter, which is that the foundations of our liberty are fundamental rights and robust institutions. It's not an authoritative, council of elders deciding what is and isn't true.
Right. Now, just maybe a last question here from Frank Brumit, and I'm going to give this to Jenny because he asks, tech companies are shaping the legal space in which they operate by actively lobbying against further regulation on antitrust, transparency, et cetera. We've seen this, for example, Section 230 was mentioned earlier, which prevents liability for tech platforms, social media, et cetera. There seemed to be bipartisan consensus that this wouldn't apply to Gen AI outputs, but now we see tech companies lobbying against that as well. So how do you as a company, respond to this issue around, on the one hand saying we need regulation, on the other hand, other parts of your company actively lobbying against it?
Well, this is one where I will differentiate us. A lot of times I try and speak on behalf of the tech industry. In this case, I'll talk on behalf of Microsoft, which is we are sincere when we say that we want to be regulated in this space. We've gone to great efforts to work with legislators around the world, help them understand the issue. Earlier it was discussed the Zuckerberg, I make money from my ads, sir, and the idea that the people asking him the questions weren't well informed. I have often looked at that as an example that actually the tech companies have failed in that. That was not, yes, the staff should have prepared their member better, but it was also the tech companies. Where were they? Why weren't they there meeting with the staff ahead of time and really preparing them and helping them understand the topic that they were discussing so they could have a more informed discussion? We have spent many, many hours across the company in different offices and conversations, both public and private, explaining foundational models, explaining the way that transparency works, explaining our sort of plans and ambitions, and having a real dialogue and conversation, all helping to inform those legislators so that when they go to create bills, we won't find ourselves in a position where we have to necessarily object. That's what happens when the process fails. If you're objecting at the point that they're trying to put legislation actually on the docket for voting, then it means you haven't been persuasive enough in your education to get to a place where, yes, we're calling for regulation, and the regulation that they're putting forward is something that we think will actually help and we'll get on board with. So I would maybe push against the premise in the first place.
Do you think, for example, that Section 230, which helped give rise to the internet and which LinkedIn enjoys, do you think that should apply to generative AI outputs?
I'm trying to remember what my higher ups have said on this, so I don't get myself into
No
trouble.
worries.
I think I know where we stand, but I want to be careful so I don't get myself into trouble.
Fair
you guys
enough.
can look it up. Search it up on Bing. I'm sure that's what you all are using.
Yeah. And what about the other two? I mean, would that help? If we heard earlier, impose legal liability for this stuff. Does that help improve facts? Does that help with the environment?
I think the answer for me is you have to go back to to pick up on something that Rasmus said. Actually, you have to have a really, really good, robust set of institutions and stakeholders that are dealing with this on a day-to-day basis, and
You sound like a politician, Graham.
You have to have media, you have to have civil society. Both of them are under threat right now. You have to have a set of public policymakers who are also under threat right now in a big way. There are a lot of people leaving public life right now. And you have to have accountability for the industry. And I don't think that's a political answer. You have to have all four of those in order to figure this out. And for me, the fundamental thing is if all of those institutions are working well and you have legal frameworks or governance frameworks that are adapting to this moment that we're facing, again, my hobby horse is going to be data privacy. But for those of you in the audience from Global Majority, you know that freedom of speech is many times based on your right to privacy. You have to have it. And we haven't totally connected those two things. If your ability to have freedom of expression, freedom of speech, and privacy are one and the same in an AI era. And until we come together on that as a bunch of institutions and agree on a framework that makes any sense whatsoever, we're going to be backfooted. And there's going to be an enormous amount of externalities that we have to address, such as whether this thing is fact or fiction.
Last word, any last thoughts or last word, Rasmus?
One of the greatest blessings of being an academic is that sometimes I not only can, but ought to say, I don't know.
Well, with that, there's a lot we still don't know, but there's a lot we do know. So I want to thank our panelists and thank the audience.